Hello, my name is Isha Sarah Snow. I am an undergraduate student and a senior at Washington State University in Vancouver, currently majoring in sociology with a minor in anthropology. Framing consciousness as a non-localized field reframes autism as an evolutionary strength and not a deficit. Our nervous systems evolved for connection, but trauma fragments it, while neurodivergence reveals those fractures and also points us towards repair. This slideshow presentation will discuss the process by which colonization fragments our identity. Identity fragmentation then destabilizes the nervous system, and also discusses how neurodiversity, autism, and the nervous system's relational attunement are the pathways to societal repair. One of the reasons why colonization is so pervasive and effective is due to the fact that we are being misdirected. So we're talking circles around the problem without actually ever getting anywhere. What we need to do is identify the core issue. The core of colonization isn't just about taking land. It's about changing the very way a people think and perceive themselves. We're talking colonization of consciousness here. Colonization is a process of simplifying and reorganizing complex societies to better serve the interests of the colonizing power. It dismantles egalitarian power structures, replacing them with a centralized colonial authority. After breaking down existing systems, colonization then reorganizes them into new, simplified categories and units that are easier to control. This process simplifies the social structure into a rigid, two-tiered binary system. A significant aspect of colonization is the reframing of what is fundamentally a consciousness issue as a polarized racial, land, or political problem. While colonization is visibly about controlling land and establishing political rule, these are the outward manifestations of a deeper ideological project, evaluating the intersectional issues that colonization creates while ignoring the foundational shift in consciousness that enables and sustains them in the first place, is trying to solve a problem from inside the problem. This is exactly what Audre Lorde meant when she discussed the master's tools not being able to undo the master's house. In order to create sustainable solutions, we need to think outside the colonial box. Let's imagine this papaya is the whole entire world, the universe, and all of existence. Inside, all the little seeds represent the people of the world. Every seed is different, with some bigger and some smaller, but they all belong to the same fruit and know themselves as a part in this greater whole. But the consciousness, the awareness of itself, doesn't belong to the individual seeds. The intelligence belongs to the entire papaya, and this is manifested throughout every facet of its design. Belonging to the same ecosystem and informed by a shared field of non-localized consciousness, the human collective is also held together, nourished, and protected like these seeds. At least, that's what human identity used to look like before colonization. We understood ourselves as relational beings, as part of a living system. My existence and your existence were never separate. We all understood ourselves as being the whole entire papaya together. We were not individual doers, but identified as all of existence and the thing that was being done. The self is only ever understood and referred to in relation to another, which defines it as belonging to part of the same cohesive whole. You are another me, in the words of Ram Dass. But colonization changed that. It teaches us to see ourselves as if we're just the separate seeds. Instead of identifying as the whole fruit, we start to think in limited, separate terms of me and mine, and the solution of an individual self, or of having a separate identity to cling to, is where concepts like competition, power, ownership, and control are introduced into society. It's also where ideas like race, gender, sexuality, and identity are imposed. That colonial shift is cultural, political, institutional, linguistic, and systemic, but ultimately, at its root, it's relational. Colonization is, by design, extremely traumatic to the nervous system. Our bodies are wired for connection, for co-regulation, for being in sync with others, for identifying as everything all at once together. When you force a collective, relational people to live in self-contained mental prisons as if they're isolated, self-contained seeds, the nervous system goes into stress and fight, flight, or fawning shutdown. This makes us easy to control and to be exploited. This is also why so many of our social struggles feel impossible. Our needs, our differences, our conflicts are framed as separate dialectical problems. Our social world becomes fractured from binary, either or, black and white, you and I, us and them, right or wrong. But the real problem isn't our differences, it's that colonization taught us to think like individuals instead of like the whole papaya. When we decolonize, we don't erase our differences, we restore ourselves as the whole. We are the fruit together, the living system, all at once. We don't have to be in competition because we are not separate individuals or seeds. By framing the colonial encounter as a land or political issue, the colonizer distracts from the deeper psychological and cultural damage being done. Colonization was the relational rupture of this whole living system knowing itself as one and operating in unison. It is therefore necessary to view colonialism as primarily a social issue created by a fractured identity rather than only a racial, political, or economic problem. This relational rupture and social wound at the root of colonialism explains why race, gender, and sexuality as rigid categories emerged historically alongside colonial projects. They were necessary tools to retrain people into thinking like individual seeds. The papaya was the whole as a living system, ecological, social, and spiritual, while the seeds are differentiated but never autonomous. The self only exists in relation to another, and nothing exists independently in a relational universe. Just like the earth is a whole living system without natural borders, statehood, the idea of nations and separate countries, civilization are all colonial constructs imposed upon this planet. Binary categories such as us and them, right and wrong, black and white are symptoms of colonial fragmentation. It is key to note here that our global conflicts only seem irresolvable because they're framed through this lens of separation and polarization. A major part of settler colonialism is the false sense of linear time being imposed upon reality, such as the constant reframing of colonialism and the violent act of dispossessing a planet and her peoples of their culture, identity, and agency as something that happened in the past a long time ago. If you Google colonialism, it will likely phrase things in the past tense with words ending in "ed". When I recently typed a paper discussing colonialism as an active and ongoing project, the autocorrect in Google Docs tried to gaslight me. Colonialism is not a relic of the past; it survives by disguising itself as history, and succeeds in hiding in plain sight by normalizing the relational dysfunction that it perpetuates. We are taught to imagine colonialism ended with independence declarations or civil rights legislation, but the logic of colonization still organizes Western daily life. The United States itself is a settler colony. Its very foundations rest on the displacement of indigenous peoples, the theft of their land, and the importation and exploitation of enslaved labor. Its states are fragmented into counties, which mirrors our fragmented psyches. These structures have evolved into reservations, prisons, borders, pipelines, and wage systems that continue to enforce domination. While the facade on the outside might change, the interior social mechanism driving colonialism remains the same: relational trauma, social fear, avoidance and distance where there should be trust, borders, walls, and conflict where there should be collaboration, communication, and community. The trick of colonialism is narrative, where it convinces us that conquest is over, so we fail to see how its systems still shape our politics, our identities, and our nervous systems through our social practices and norms today. The trick of colonialism is narrative, where it convinces us that our identity is an individual being existing in separation, and that colonialism happened a long time ago. But imagine the entire universe and all of existence itself as a single body. Every organ, every cell, every vein, every neuron is a part of this living whole. The hand does not exist without the arm does not exist without the torso, and none of it exists without the breath that animates the entire system. Each part is distinct, but none can survive or be understood apart from the body itself. Before colonization, human identity worked this way. We knew ourselves not as isolated parts, but as belonging to the planet as a singular living organism. And we know this by studying indigenous language. The I was always understood in relation to the we, just as a hand knows itself through its relation to the arm and the body. We were animated by one shared life force, nourished by the same circulation, and directed by the same intelligence that belongs not to the separate parts, but to the body as a whole. Colonization severed this awareness. It taught us to imagine we are only separate parts, like an isolated hand, a detached eye, a single cell living on its own. Instead of belonging to a whole body, we are tricked into believing we are autonomous, self-contained, and in competition with each other for survival. This is where ideas like race, gender, and rigid identity categories emerge as labels that classify parts of the body as if they exist separately. But these labels haven't always existed, and no matter how powerful a hand thinks it is, without the heart, the lungs, and the nervous system, it can't survive. Colonization confuses us into fighting each other for control, even though we are always parts of the same organism. The body is wired for homeostasis, for coordination, and for coherence. When its parts are forced into competition or tricked into believing they are isolated, the body goes into stress. Muscles tighten, the immune system falters, the nervous system flips into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. This is exactly what happened to humanity. Colonization fragmented us, and the whole organism suffers with chronic dysregulation. This is what has happened to the earth as well. Our bodies are a direct reflection of our planet and vice versa. Healing comes not from erasing our differences, but from remembering we are all one singular body, each part unique, yet belonging, interdependent, and sustained by the same earth. This is literally the definition of land back. When indigenous people mention wanting land back, that's only talking about one side of the coin. The flip side of that is that the earth wants her people back. She wants you all to remember that you are her. Shown on this slide, there has been a significant amount of both theory and experimental research into the area of non-localized consciousness. Rupert Sheldrake proposed that systems, whether biological, social, or mental, are shaped by fields of information he calls morphic fields. These fields carry memory and patterning across time and space, guiding both development and human behavior. Amelie Durkheim used the term collective consciousness in sociology to mean the shared beliefs, norms, and moral attitudes that unify a society. Jung's collective unconsciousness is psychic and symbolic rather than social. Together, they suggest that individuals are embedded in both social fields and psychic fields, which act non-locally in shaping identity and behavior. James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis proposed the Gaia hypothesis, which argues that Earth operates as a self-regulating system much like an organism. Later interpretations expand this to include consciousness-like processes and the planet as an integrated intelligence. If humans are part of Gaia, then our minds are organs of a larger planetary system. This frames human consciousness as nodes within a distributed ecological intelligence. Put together, all of these ideas imply that consciousness may be networked across humans and embedded in a biosphere itself, not reducible to neurons alone. Carl Jung's collective unconscious provides the psychic layer, Durkheim's collective consciousness the social layer, and Lovelock's Gaia theory the ecological layer. When combined, these map a non-local, multi-level field of consciousness in which individuals are not isolated minds but relational beings, woven into humanity's shared psyche and the living Earth. This matters for autism and neurodiversity because if morphic fields exist, then neurodivergent people may be essential carriers of relational diversity in field resonance. Relational cognition understands human actions through the lens of connection, attunement, and co-regulation, as opposed to the Western-centric biomedical model, which isolates individuals and focuses on separate cognitive processes without considering crucial environmental, social, and emotional context. Colonization changes the ways that we relate to each other as a deeply somatic and co-regulatory species. Instead of understanding behavior as communication of our nervous systems, colonization pathologizes human distress. Behavior was our first language before words, but colonization and its culture of fear has made us lose our ability to understand and relate to each other in this deeply empathetic and uniquely human way. Similar to how the neurodivergent and neurotypical binary was socially created and sustained, homosexuality as a cultural artifact is also interesting because it relies on gender binaries that were socially constructed and introduced into Western culture. The Bible originally condemned pederasty, or the practice of men having inappropriate sexual relations with young boys, in its original Hebrew language, a common practice among Greeks at the time. But the translation was eventually changed to homosexuality and the phrase "men lying with men" added to the Bible, right around the exact same time period that Somerville described homosexuality being culturally invented right alongside the invention of race. These socially manufactured identity issues are evidence of colonialism being an active and ongoing coordinated project and shows how history is constantly being manipulated and rewritten in front of our eyes. The concepts of gender, race, and sexuality were imposed alongside individualistic ideals, targeting the ways that we relate to each other, making colonization inherently relational. Decolonization, therefore, must be defined as moving beyond separate identity concepts such as gender, race, and sexuality or neurodivergency, and shifting from individual self to the singularity. You are it. Who are you beyond your limiting self-beliefs and cultural concepts? You are all of existence. So is everyone else. Colonization is a whole being fractured into smaller parts. The we and us is broken down into I and you. Before the Enlightenment, religion was the structuring principle of social life. From the Enlightenment onward, it became relegated to one identity among others, alongside race, class, gender, and sexuality. Enlightenment rationalism and colonial expansion gave rise to racial classification systems, which hardened race into a biological identity tied to hierarchy and colonial domination. Behavior became synonymous with identity after psychology became a recognized field. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the eugenics movement institutionalized pseudoscientific ideas of hereditary fitness, influencing immigration policy, sterilization laws, and contributing to racial hierarchies. Identification leads to marginalization. The social invention of separate and central categorical identity has directly facilitated genocide and historical atrocities such as the Holocaust. But what if action actually unfolds naturally, and the idea of a separate doer is imposed by thought? What if part of colonization is linguistically and cognitively creating this idea and these thoughts of ourselves as having a separate identity apart from the whole? Modern identity categories such as religion, race, gender, sexuality, and class didn't always exist the way that we know them today. They co-emerged over the last few centuries, shaped by Enlightenment rationalism, colonialism, and industrialization. In the Enlightenment, religion shifted from being the universal worldview to a matter of private belief, while science began classifying humans into racial types. At the same time, binary gender roles were codified, sexuality was still framed as a sin, and philosophers like Rousseau critiqued inequality, setting the stage for class politics. By the 19th century, colonial expansion hardened these categories. Race became the foundation of global hierarchy, binary gender was exported worldwide, sexuality was pathologized by psychiatry, and Marx and Engels reframed class as the central axis of struggle. Early feminism and religious revivals also made identity a site of contestation. In the early 20th century, identity categories became formalized through science and law. Religion was studied sociologically, eugenics institutionalized race, women won suffrage, Freud made sexuality a core part of the self, and sociologists analyzed alienation and stratification. Finally, in the mid-20th century, these categories became politicized. The civil rights movement reframed race as political identity, gender was distinguished from sex, homosexuality became an identity category, fueling queer liberation, Jewish identity was reframed through Holocaust memory, and class shaped the rise of welfare states and socialism. The takeaway is this: these categories did not evolve separately. They developed in parallel, reinforcing each other, and were often used by colonial systems to fragment the collective psyche and nervous system. Understanding this history shows us that identity is not natural or fixed. It is produced, contested, and deeply tied to power. Our nervous systems evolved in hunter-gatherer societies where survival depended on cooperation, co-regulation, and collective identity, which means that safety came from being in sync with others. When social or relational trauma occurs through exclusion, neglect, or coercion, it disrupts this design and embeds fragmentation directly into the nervous system, leaving people stuck in chronic fight, flight, or shutdown. Autism and other forms of neurodivergence are often more sensitive to these fractures because they are finely tuned to relational cues and systemic patterns. According to the discordant hypothesis, traits like autism are not defects, but are adaptive variations that persist because they actually bring survival advantages to the group, such as pattern recognition, innovation, and moral clarity. What gets pathologized as oversensitivity is often an accurate detection of disconnection, showing how colonial fragmentation harms the collective nervous system and explaining why healing requires restoring connection and belonging. If we take the non-local consciousness lens and use it to look through Carl Jung's collective unconscious, Durkheim's collective consciousness, and Gaia theory, along with the experimental research I've mentioned on the earlier slide, then autism and neurodiversity now look radically different from how Western psychiatry usually frames them. Autism and neurodiversity are no longer malfunctions of isolated brains, but are instead expressions of the collective psyche and planetary mind, and are cultural signals that our species needs diversity of consciousness to heal its fragmentation and restore itself to balance. Instead of fixing autistic people, healing means reharmonizing the field in three ways. First, psychically, by honoring archetypal roles neurodivergent people often embody, such as truth tellers, seers, pattern holders, shamans. Second, socially, by designing trauma-informed, accessible structures that allow multiple frequencies of consciousness to coexist together peacefully. And third, ecologically, by recognizing neurodiverse sensitivity as a warning system from Gaia, such as sensory overwhelming, reflecting real environmental toxicity of the planet and not just individual overreaction. When societies become fragmented through colonialism, capitalism, and authoritarianism, the collective field is dysregulated. Neurodivergent people often feel this most acutely. Autistic burnout, sensory overwhelm, and alienation reflect the cost of being overexposed to incoherent signals in the social field. What is pathologized as inability to cope may in fact be accurate detection of dysfunction in collective consciousness. If we accept that consciousness is interconnected, then exclusion of neurodivergent people doesn't just harm individuals, it weakens the entire collective field. Inclusion is not just a moral obligation, it is a survival necessity for humanity and Gaia. Neurodivergence reframed becomes evidence of different neural gateways into the collective field of mind. Together, these quotes illustrate how mental distress is often a distortion of the collective field and not an individual defect. Neurodivergence, far from being brokenness, represents alternative ways of attuning to the shared human and planetary consciousness. What society calls symptoms or illness are often survival strategies within oppressive systems. Healing emerges not by forcing people into neuronormative expectations, but by reharmonizing the social and ecological fields so diverse frequencies can coexist in balance together. In the human brain, neurons create the patterns, but electromagnetic fields unify them into local consciousness, and non-local consciousness proposes that these fields may be entangled or connected within larger collective and ecological systems. Neurons only become conscious when their signals are unified by the electromagnetic field. Without that integrative resonance, activity stays fragmented. Neurodivergence in society are very much like electromagnetic fields in the brain, who integrate, amplify, and expose patterns that reveal the coherence or incoherence of the system. They don't just add another signal, they often show how the whole thing fits together. Individual people are like neurons firing their local messages, but without integrators, the collective risks incoherence. Non-local consciousness is the living matrix that holds it all together. Our psyche, society, and planet. Individuals resonate with it differently depending on their sensitivity. Neurodivergent minds often act like sensitive antennas to this non-local field, feeling ecological grief, collective trauma, or unspoken truths more acutely than neurotypicals. By regulating the nervous system through developing a daily practice such as meditation, journaling, intentional mindfulness, walks, and time spent in nature, somatic body movement, or yoga, anyone can tune their antennas to gain access to our non-localized field of thought. The old, binary, and polarized Western model sees consciousness as sealed inside the skull, a byproduct of neurons. Colonialism, capitalism, and reductionist science privatized our consciousness, teaching us to see ourselves as isolated egos. This severed our link to the collective unconscious and meaning, the collective consciousness and shared belonging, and Gaia as ourselves, part of the living earth. The evidence of this relational severance can be seen all around us as social alienation, ecological destruction, loneliness, and systemic trauma. Trauma is relational by its very nature because fear only exists in relation to something. Fear doesn't exist by itself. As opposed to just being a mindset issue, trauma imprints in our bodies and on our nervous system. Luckily, love is also relational and it heals us. If consciousness is non-local, then healing must be relational, collective, and ecological. We are not separate islands of awareness. We are waves on a shared ocean of mind, each with our own shape, but inseparable from the larger waters of humanity and Earth. Forgetting this creates fragmentation, but remembering it restores coherence to the field. I would like to close this presentation with a short practice. When I first started meditating, I thought I was doing it wrong because I couldn't stop thinking. But then I learned that meditation isn't about stopping the thoughts entirely, it's about becoming aware of them as separately occurring phenomenon and cultivating a space between the thoughts and my identification with them. I learned to focus on the breath going in and out of my nostrils. And whenever a thought became too distracting, I would gently guide myself back to the breath by becoming aware of my nostrils and the breath moving through them. I am about to ask you to close your eyes, take a few deep breaths with me, and then we will visualize a door together. It's okay if you've never meditated before, I'll walk you through this. So at this time, I will ask you to find a comfortable position and close your eyes. Settle into your body and find a position that you can sustain for an amount of time, 5 minutes. And then just take a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second, and then exhale for 3. We're going to do that a second time. Take a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second, then exhale for 3. This is the last one. Take a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second, then exhale for 3. Now with our eyes closed, we will begin to breathe normally, paying attention to our breath, moving in and out of our nostrils. And I want you to try to visualize or imagine with your eyes closed while we're breathing through our nose that you're standing before a doorway. Really picture the details on this door. How does it look? Is it a specific color? Does it have a certain handle or windows, perhaps? It can be made of wood, metal, or glass. Imagine your door and picture yourself standing in front of it. When you see the door in front of you, you will also notice that there are walls on either side because you're standing inside of a dwelling. When you breathe in, the door of your house stays shut. When you breathe out, imagine the door swinging wide open to the outside world. Breathe in, and the door swings shut. Breathe out, and the door is open. Beyond the door, you can imagine seeing sunlight and trees and hear the sounds of birds and rushing water. When you breathe in, the door shuts and the sounds fade. When you breathe out, the door is open again. Breathe in, and the door swings shut. Breathe out, and the door is wide open to the world. The next time we breathe out, the door will open and the walls around us will slowly fade away. The walls are becoming transparent. We can see trees through the walls, and then the walls are gone. The house is gone. We are standing in a forest clearing, but the door and the door frame are still there in front of us. Breathing in, we are standing in front of our empty doorway. We step through the door. Breathing out, there is no door. Breathing in, your body starts to disappear just like the walls. Breathing out, you're gone, and there is just the forest. Now, as the forest, I want you to practice taking a few deep breaths. Settle into your forest body, digging your roots into the soil and feeling your branches reach up to the sky. Take a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second and then exhale for 3. Do it a second time, taking a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second and then exhale for 3. Last time, take a deep breath in, counting to 3. Hold it for 1 second. Exhale for 3. With our eyes closed, we will begin to breathe normally, paying attention to our breath moving through our nostrils. And then we can slowly open our forest eye and find 3 things in our visual space to remind us where our human body is. It can be a color, an object, a landmark, a piece of furniture, a pet. Just find 3 things around you right now with your eyes. After grounding yourself back in your present moment, we can leave the space carrying a forest in our hearts and identifying as the entire world. Anytime you forget who you are, you can come back to this space, find your door, breathe until it disappears, step through your empty doorway, and know that you are all of it. Wayne William Snellgrove of the Saulteaux Tribe and Fishing Lake First Nation said, "The problem is when we start prioritizing life. Who and what is more important? All life is sacred." This is a list of the sources that I cited in this slideshow presentation. I've also written a paper in support of this and posted it to my Substack account for Autistic Standpoint Theory, or under Isha Snow. Thank you very much for watching.